Hi, I'm Becky Johnson with Sweetheart Quilt Design Company. And today we're going to talk about framing a block. So what I mean by that, I've got these cute little bears. And say if I wanted to make this block but without the star, but I wanted to put the teddy bear in the middle there. So clearly it's not big enough. I need a 6.5 inch square for my teddy bear. So I want to do a frame around it. So I'm going to show you the math here. So the block size that I need is 6.5, and the block to be framed is 4 inches. So here's the math. You start with 6.5, subtract your 4 inches, which leaves 2.5. And then we're going to add 1 inch for the seam allowances. So when you sew those on, you have 2 seams. So you're 1/4 inch on either side. So 1/4 inch times 2 is 1/2, times 2 is 1 inch. So that's where we come up with the 1 inch. So you get 3.5, and then we're going to divide that by 2 because we're doing 2 sides. That gives us 1 3/4. So the cutting for that is 2 at 1 3/4 times 4 inches, and 2 at 1 3/4 times 6.5 inches. And then I always double check my math just to make sure I'm right. So 4 plus 1 3/4 plus 1 3/4 equals 7.5, minus your 1 inch seam allowance, give me 6.5. So yay! However, the reality of it is that you will rarely find a 4 inch square. And more than likely, it's going to be 3 7/8 by 4 1/8 or something like that. And I owned a quilt shop for 9 years, and I never could figure out why they weren't square. I finally decided that no designer would design them not square, so it had to be something in the process of printing the fabric. And so I just gave up trying to figure out the logic of it. Okay, this is the reality of it. So what you want to do then is measure your block, and you still know this. So if you give an approximate size and you do this math, then you know approximately where you are, and then cut them bigger. So instead of cutting them at 1 3/4, cut them at 2 inches. Instead of 4.5, cut them at 4.5 and 7. And then what you do is you sew them on both sides. So, and then you want to trim this. If you don't trim this, when you go to put your piece on, you'll either have a real shy seam allowance, and you can see on this one I need to get rid of this little light piece, so I need a full seam allowance, or you'll try and make your piece match up to the seam allowance, and then you'll kind of end up with a concave curve. So you want to go ahead and trim that, making sure you're lined up with your block. So I've got my 1/4 inch line lined up just inside the block. It's black on navy, so you can't really see it. But make sure you're lined up square with your block. Okay, so let me do that again. Have to eyeball that just a little bit. All right, so we'll get rid of those pieces. And then we're ready to sew on the other sides, the 6 inch pieces. And they don't quite fit because I cut them at 6.5. So they're not quite long enough, but that's okay because we're going to trim it. Now the problem, or I cut these at 6.5, and I should have cut them at 7 like I just told you to, because I found that left me with the situation of trying to center that. What I also could have done is when after I trimmed this, then I could have taken and trimmed off these sides. That would have been the easiest thing, and made it square. So I'm just measuring it. So I have a little more than 1.5 inches here and a little more than 1.5 inches. So if you trim these 2 sides, Then when you go to put your 6.5 inch strips on there, they fit perfectly and you don't have to worry about any kind of centering. I did mine just a little bit off because I didn't do that trimming step right there. So I'm gonna have to go back and shift this one over a little bit. But you can see that you can center it up and you can figure out the math, but what I usually do is just say, okay, there's 1.5 inches, so it's slightly more than that. Here's 1.5 inches, slightly more than that. And then I'll go ahead and trim. I can trim this much of it. Yeah, fix that one side. Oops. Don't want to trim that off. I need that. Okay, so we'll just take it to there. So you can see I'll need to shift this piece. But then you end up with your nice 6.5 inch square that you can take and put in the center of the block. And see how cute that looks? All right, so have fun with that. I love fussy cutting.